This video, I'm going to be philosophizing on personal responsibility as it concerns the personality characteristics of personal responsibility, most concerned with engaging the distinct intracategorical and or intercategorical effectivenesses and or efficiencies, optimizing one's subjective well-being with the overarching subcomponents of planning and or initiative and or self-committedness. Planning, I will refer to in this video in some cases to mean futurism, as we engage, as it pertains personal responsibility, more ubiquitously in terms of capturing all the subcomponent personality characteristics, engages the executive functioning. As one evaluates certain risks and or benefits, be it that one is engaging healthy psychological functioning, expected responsible conducts that are future-oriented. Individuals who lack a executive function altogether would have serious deficits and or be unable to engage nearly all appropriate conducts within duty of care, and more likely lack personal responsibility altogether. Meaning that had one found themselves being tried for a crime, the most compassionate sentence may be to, in some cases, detain the individual in a psychiatric ward and or compassionately execute the individual, as one may never be able to appropriately regulate their conducts. And there is perhaps the best evidence for personality with the famous case of Phineas Gage, whom had his frontal lobe pierced with a spike of a train track iron that pierced his skull and a section of his executive function, meaning he still had some of his executive function intact and was able to resume meaningful work as a individual whom drove carriages with horses. Yet he had meaningful impairments in terms of inhibiting certain expected, more polite responses, subsequently engaging more rude and or often irrational and or irresponsible conducts he had not engaged prior, and in some cases misconducts and or perhaps crimes that he may have been exempt from, perhaps even what may have been disproportionate in terms of too lenient of a sentence, not appropriately satisfying his underlying psychological needs. As he was able to resume meaningful work, yet died a relatively more impaired existentia, shortened by the injury, resulting most likely in the inability to engage certain expected healthy psychological functioning, impairing his responsible conducts that may have otherwise prolonged his life. As personal responsibility is one of the best predictors for longevity and or optimizing one's lifespan, engaging more health behaviors, in specific the correct perception and or correct action and or correct behavior that optimizes domain-specific healthy psychological functioning. Within the desired direction of meaningful effect, one self-tasks certain goals that are future-oriented, always in relation to personal goals, as goals should be personal goals to be meaningful, and or one is more likely to satisfy goals that are originating within one's subjectivity and or not another individual's subjectivity, to clarify most clearly within crystal clarity what one values in relation to the goal and or the details of the goal that one is most meaningfully concerned with resolving to accomplish the goal. Engaging more initiative and or responsibidades, undertaking the voluntary suffering and responsibidades in order to satisfy uniquely the necessary conditions, never the unnecessary conditions that will otherwise impair one's conducts to appropriately satisfy one's goals. As unnecessary conditions are more inherently vague and or intrinsically harmful to engaging productive and or proactive conducts, wasting time and or energy. That tends to be why they're unnecessarily unnecessary compared to what's necessarily necessary, needing one to conduct those specific sub-objectives and or objectives in order to accomplish X in relation to one's goals and or optimize certain internal and or external conditions in relation to satisfying certain relevant and or meaningful underlying psychological needs, be it that you need to eat and or drink and or rest and or maintain certain body temperatures appropriate to engaging the healthy psychological functioning and or expected conducts that fuel often the more complex, higher order cognition to think complex thoughts and or navigate more difficult, cumbersome internal and or external conditions to optimize your fitness. As you engage more healthier conducts, engaging the correct perception, correct action and or correct behavior calibrated to your cultivations of self-knowledge and or self-awareness, uniquely domain-specific to the personal goals you self-task to accomplish, engaging the futurism to think responsible thoughts derived from objective statistical data. The most meaningful inferences are derived from meta-analytic studies that are domain-specific to X in terms of your personal goal and or the conducts you may infer certain effect sizes appropriate to maximize certain outcomes related to the optimizing conducts you infer from what works across distinct situations and or distinct individuals whom had engaged the meaningful similarities within your personal set goals that allowance for the optimizing of self-navigations in order to accomplish those goals. Be it you're interested in a certain career path and or actualizing a certain career. Yet this career needs you to go to university. to obtain a university education and or a diploma, to hold the credentials in order to do some complex self-task in relation to certain self-knowledge and or self-awareness that is expected of individuals within that profession. In order to accomplish this more difficult goal, you need to get good grades on complex examinations, needing you to study, and you to study, not to cheat and or lie, so that you cultivate the self-knowledge and or self-awareness to communicate clearly. Had you not held the tools and or technologies and or being with the individuals you may be cheating and or lying about your test scores with as you engage testing. Meaning that personal responsibility involves the individual whom is taking notes and or studying those notes in relation to this domain-specific pursuit. Engaging tried and true, meaningful, step-by-step approaches that you can detail out in terms of what it takes to meaningfully accomplish your goals in relation to a more difficult life goal. That allowances for meaningful navigations within what already exists in terms of easier access and or evaluation of knowledge within meta-analytic studies, as there are many studies out there on testing and or what conducts you may conduct to optimize your test scoring in terms of the performance on a test, regardless of the topic and or subject matter you may be learning, as there are certain tried and true conducts that are most reliable. For example, you may engage, one of the most well-established is the Cornell method of note-taking that involves color coding and or organizing the systematization of meaningful information on a page that you may conduct within a lecture and or reading a textbook, involving the margin of the sheet of paper, be it a lined sheet of paper. You may take a, say, red pen and or draw a line within a reverse L shape to box sections of the sheet of paper to have a margin on the left side of the sheet of paper. You may, within future-oriented note-taking, as you engage more meaningful thinking, draw lines to certain other notes that you have transcribed to the sheet of paper, the key points that summarize certain information and or may include certain definitions, with the central, most meaningful key points within the center of the page, and or you may organize your notes in terms of, be it you are defining a certain term, may for the term itself, the analytic term, you write within one color, be it purple, and or another color, be it black, that allowances for you to more easier access and or evaluate self-knowledge and or self-awareness within what you have transcribed on the sheet of paper. This allowance is for you to meaningfully retrieve and or creatively engage more mobile thinking in terms of note-taking from the color coding of meaningful information and or the appropriate organization that allows for easier access to knowledge and or complex information. That there are existing meta-analytic studies, not just a study and or two studies that were done inadequately and or even that were awesome studies that had amazing measures and or a robust effect size derived from a relatively high population of individuals that were sampled, over 120, as be it that you were reading a academic journal article, you should look for studies that have an N over 120, as this tends to be the most reliable. Yet be it that there is an N of 100,786, this is more likely to result in diminished returns with little effect on the reliability compared to if you had an N of 1,787. There may be very little meaningful difference compared to 120 to the 1,776. That compared to the diminished returns that you have within the N of 100,760 X is not as meaningful as the latter two. In terms of evaluating meta-analytic studies, there is a distinction that's meaningful as the variance is accounted for in terms of, be it that there are some low quality studies included that hold an N of 83 and or 97 compared to holding the bulk of studies that are within 758 compared to 1,346. Those studies are more likely to be reliable, be it that there are more studies that hold an average above 120 in terms of the N value, that control for the inadequacies of certain other studies. There are other issues that may existingly influence certain meta-analytic studies that include inaccurate measures and or certain populations the study may be conducted that may not be as universalizable, yet compared to other studies that are conducted in a more universalizable population, allowance for more meaningful, reliable inferences. In some cases, certain studies are omitted even within the data analysis that will be reported in the literature review before you read the methods within a research paper that the statistical analysis is reported. Meaning that often the low quality studies are omitted and or are more likely to be omitted. Yet most meta-analysis will clarify the amount of low, moderate to high quality studies within often the literature review and or the methods, with the methods perhaps most meaningful to evaluate the most meaningful inclusion criteria. Yet one should read the whole paper, as there are many individuals whom lie and or cheat, whom skim through meta-analytic work that is highly meaningful to summarize the most meaningful results within a field and or subfield, and or even certain meaningful research papers that one should read from the introduction to the conclusion in its completeness, as there tends to be meaningful key points throughout the entire article, not just within one section, and or often to appreciate the meaningful effect size, you need to hold certain key points, as there often are contingencies and or issues with measurement that may be included within the literature review and or the discussion of a article, where some individuals may just be concerned with collecting the data from the methods and or jump to the conclusion and or skim through the discussions without almost ever reading the literature review that the bulk of the theory is, and or often the other work that you will not read within the rest of the paper that's meaningful for exploratory research and future-oriented navigations, that is irresponsible, be it that one is conducting more responsible duty of care in terms of cultivating meaningful self-knowledge and or self-awareness. Reading a full article from the introduction to the conclusion is the best meaningful thing that you may conduct. This is not to say that one should not skim through an article they are unsure is worth time, be it that they're deliberating on reading one article compared to 10 other articles, as time may be a meaningful consideration. Yet, as you opt for one article to read, you should read the introduction to the conclusion, instead of only reading the data points you are most concerned with, pretending you have read a whole article and bragging about the amount of articles you've read that you actually factually did not meaningfully read at all, with more gaps in meaningful information that you may think that others will not pick up on, yet they will, especially the individuals whom had read the complete article, as they've read the complete article and they likely practice reading complete articles, and they've likely encountered experientially other individuals who tend to engage the same lying and or cheating conducts, with more vagueness in the communications of the literature instead of creative communications inferring the limitations often of the measures. Individuals whom are more cynical of the data, as they lack the knowledge to be critical and engage critical thinking of the appropriate limitations of certain studies, thinking in one case, having reported that this study has shown X, is then told by another individual that study was wrong and or less meaningful than another study that had counterfactual information in it. Not holding the meaningful self-knowledge and or self-awareness to think critically, to think what one thinks. Instead, is more likely to be in a sort of information crisis without contextualizing the data appropriate to what would be communicated often in the literature review. As the literature review summarizes the literature from other data and or meaningful information, as one whom is more dedicated and or engaging responsible reading of the research article will more likely be able to discern the areas of weakness and or the strengths in terms of the reliability across distinct meaningful similarities within articles that are domain specific, to more meaningfully connect patterns explicitly and or implicitly to allowance for more meaningful creative connections and or associations from the consistency of certain data that you often infer and or will experientially encounter, be it that you read a meta-analysis in the field that summarizes the literature within not just the literary communication within the literature review, yet a empirical statistical analysis that combines effect sizes. Meaningful for inferring the most meaningful best practices within a certain area, including the best and or faulty limitations of certain measurement instruments, to allowance for clear communication, not uniquely on the effect sizes, yet often the measurement instruments those effect sizes are derived from within the data analysis, to optimize the most meaningful communication that summarizes the most meaningful effect sizes from often the most responsible individuals whom are conducting the meta-analysis with the appropriate duty of care, having most likely read countless articles from introduction to conclusion concerning uniquely the best meta-analysis, as there are poorly done meta-analytic reviews that individuals skim through and or uniquely may just pick certain effect sizes to calculate the Cohen's d with a p-value that is sufficient enough to allowance for one to publish, that is meaningful for communicating more vague communications on effect sizes without as much meaningful detail. In some cases, one may only read the abstract, yet the abstract and or uniquely reading the abstract is truly only meaningful to determine whether or not you should read this article and or to save time in terms of evaluating what articles one should read. Not necessarily to read the abstract to treat it as reading the full article, as there are likely certain contingencies within the article that limit even the findings within the study that are not clear in terms of the abstract. Yet there are plenty of abstracts out there that are truly detailed enough within the brevity of communication that tend to summarize fairly well the complete study, with certain gaps in meaningful information that tend to be more on the periphery. This should not mean that one should not read the introduction to the completion of the article, as there are still key points that are missed in terms of the abstract. Even if certain limitations are included in the abstract, does not mean that there may be certain meaningful information in terms of the theory and or other limitations not communicated within the abstract. So one should read had one opted to read a certain article, the introduction to the conclusion to engage more responsible thinking. Responsible conducts within personal responsibility engage more distinctions in terms of merely planning that engages future-oriented thinking and or may include initiative, be it that one engages the self-tasking to conduct X and or engages initiative uniquely to what the self desires, never another individual. And some parents more likely to be in collectivist nation states and or whom often are raising children who one may think one should shape and or form their goals for them and or encourage them to take initiative, often with Eastern backgrounds that most collectivist nation states are from and originate, as there are often more pressures in terms of children to go to, say, medical school and or law school to take on more personal responsibility. Yet initiative uniquely needs to originate from the individual in relation to their personal goals to engage appropriately the initiative. For example, had I told you to wash the dishes, this is not you taking the initiative, and nor could it ever be you taking the initiative. You were told to wash the dishes. Had I told you you should wash the dishes more often, does not necessarily mean the individual is taking the initiative the next time they are washing the dishes. Had you asked them, well, last time you told me to wash the dishes, so I decided I should wash the dishes. This does not necessarily mean that the individual is engaging in more meaningful initiative. Had one the personal goal to achieve a certain grade on a test, going back to the former example, and without asking your child is engaging in studying and studying for the test that's upcoming. This is initiative. It's connected to an individual's goal. So you might think, well, what should I do? Well, you should encourage your child to engage more planning and or to engage more detailed self-tasking in terms of their goal, to clearly write out the main central objectives with the sub-objectives to the goal, to complete the goal, with a step-by-step approach to how one will accomplish the goal, with what's most likely to probabilistically work, as well to engage the futurism to think of what is most probabilistically to prevent and or threaten one from accomplishing one's goal, to think in advance what one may engage in terms of brainstorming certain solutions in advance to problem solve the areas of potential setback in order to optimize one's likelihood of success, prioritizing the step-by-step conducts one may doably do in terms of the direction of desired meaningful effect. Never engaging the impossible conducts that are unrealistic, meaning that one's goals should be realistic and or practical, not unrealistic and or impractical, so one may accomplish their goals. This is more likely to allow an individual to engage in the initiative, even had they not written down certain conducts. They're more likely to think of creative solutions to certain problems they may experientially encounter in relation to accomplishing the goal. That allowance for more domain-specific initiative. Engaging the executive functioning, exercising the future-oriented risk and or benefit evaluations within increasing the self-knowledge and or self-awareness of the probabilistic navigations forward. That allowance for even what one had engaged certain mind wandering, perhaps never quite taking seriously the probabilistic possibilities, thinking perhaps certain thoughts were impossible, yet may have desired to engage in certain impossible conducts one may have never been able to, within not having undertaken the personal responsibility to truly bring into existence the opportunities to allowance for forward thinking in terms of accomplishing certain incremental goals, that allowance for one to cultivate the self-knowledge and or self-awareness of what's actually factually probabilistically possible, allowancing for truly what futurism is about, that most meaningfully concerns thinking about what's possible in the future, not necessarily maybe possible now, yet maybe possible had one engaged X conducts to potentiate certain possibilities from what certain conducts entail to result in certain future-oriented doables. Meaning that one may not conduct certain conducts had one not conducted X in the prior existing posteriori self-tasking one had not conducted to, in the future, never be able to conduct X and or actualize X goal. For example, there is an upcoming test that you desire to cultivate the self-knowledge and or self-awareness to factual communicate clearly the information that you're learning, not arbitrarily and or communicating what is made up in terms of being fictional compared to non-fictional information that is irrelevant and or inappropriate to the expected responses and or creative responses that are unique to you, that satisfy the as a must be good enough and necessarily necessary criteria to result in the desired grade. As there are correct responses and there are incorrect responses on tests. This does not mean that there are limited to only one unique response in, say, open response questions, that you may engage more critical thinking, as there may be an infinite amount of domain-specific responses that are correct, yet a vaster range of infinite incorrect responses. And there are always more incorrect responses than there are correct responses. Be it that you may be asked to engage some certain creative solution to a complex problem in terms of providing meaningful communications on the recommended restorative justice practice, that you think would provide best treatment, drawing from certain recommended sentencing goals. You may not hold the self-knowledge and or self-awareness of the sentencing goals and or even what restorative justice is, more likely to result in a bad grade had you not engaged the studying. Yet, had you held the meaningful information to be able to clearly communicate what restorative justice is within your unique articulations of what restorative justice is, as others may communicate an adequate, meaningful response to allowance for the appropriate grades that are desired in terms of satisfying the necessary conditions to get the grades in terms of responding to what restorative justice is, and or holding some self-knowledge and or self-awareness into the appropriate sentencing goals that you connect to your own creative communications. Meaning that there are an infinite range of vast combinations of analytic terms that you may communicate that allow you to get the best test scores. Yet there is a smaller range of correct responses than there is incorrect responses, meaning that there is a larger vastness ranging of incorrect responses, be it that you did not hold the appropriate knowledge of what restorative justice is and provided instead a definition of chicken wings. This is inherently incorrect, and or be it that you provided a definition of retribution justice, retribution compared to restorative justice, you would be incorrect in terms of the approach to treatment in terms of how an individual will be treating the offender. Had you thought that the sentencing goals should be so other individuals do not get angry at the judge, you would be incorrect, as the most appropriate sentencing goal would be either the protection of the public and or preventing and or mitigating future-oriented reoffending specific to the case and or the evidence within the case to appropriately treat the criminal for criminality. These are well-established sentencing goals. So you may communicate incorrectly and or correctly, and there are more incorrect answers. Had you engaged more responsible studying, you would be more able to provide creative responses and or detail clearly the communications more likely to result in the desired grade. Engaging the prior existing initiative to cultivate the self-knowledge and or self-awareness in association to your desired goal. Compared to the last